Have you ever wondered why the very intensity you feel for someone often seems to vanish the moment you try to hold on to it? The paradox of desire is rarely explained in the stories women are told. They say, if you love him, show it constantly, if you want him, pursue relentlessly, yet Carl Jung taught that the psyche resists the grasp, that the deeper pull of the human heart emerges not from pursuit, but from absence, mystery, and the subtle dance of self-possession. Today, we delve into the unseen architecture of attraction, the quiet strategies that make a man emotionally tethered, not through pressure, but through the magnetic gravity of your own conscious presence. Some women mistake attachment for affection, believing that the louder the signal of their desire, the stronger his return will be. But the male psyche, much like a mirror to the feminine soul, responds not to noise but to resonance. Every man carries within him a shadow of longing, an unconscious hunger for acknowledgement that he cannot manufacture on his own. When a woman begins to cultivate her internal world with depth, curiosity, and unyielding dignity, she activates an invisible code, a magnetic blueprint that draws him in, often against his own conscious intention. It is here, in the quiet alignment of presence and self-respect, that emotional addiction, gentle, profound, irrevocable, begins to form. Imagine a woman who moves through her days untethered by his fluctuations, who laughs freely without measuring its impact on him, who nurtures herself in ways that do not require validation. In the soft spaces of her autonomy, she becomes unknowable yet deeply desired. Her laughter is not a lure but a signal of wholeness, her gaze is not pleading, but commanding attention through quiet certainty. Every interaction she offers is a gift, not a demand, and in that generosity of self, he experiences a rare pleasure, the realization that he cannot possess, cannot predict, cannot extinguish the fire she carries within. This is the essence of subtle influence, where absence amplifies presence, where restraint generates longing. Do you see how easily the dynamics of chase can invert when the woman steps into the unshakable center of her own being? In traditional narratives, women are told to bend, to yield, to compromise endlessly for love. Yet, Jungian psychology reveals that the attraction of men is often a reflection of what they cannot contain within themselves. A man is drawn to what stirs his shadow, what challenges his equilibrium, what awakens a hunger he has long ignored. By cultivating mystery, by embracing the richness of her internal life, a woman becomes a mirror to his deepest, often unacknowledged, desires. She becomes, simultaneously, a haven and a puzzle, a presence that resists simple consumption and demands attentive engagement. Notice the way subtlety works, not through manipulation, but through layered authenticity. The woman who becomes emotionally addictive does not fabricate intrigue, nor does she wield uncertainty as a weapon. Instead, she cultivates rhythms, boundaries, and patterns that speak of value. She knows when to lean in and when to step back, not as a game, but as a reflection of self-knowledge. In these patterns, he perceives her as scarce yet ever-present, consistent yet unpredictable, strong yet tender. Each interaction is weighted with depth because she carries within her an entire universe that he has only begun to glimpse. And it is precisely this richness of being, the unspeakable fullness of self, that begins to etch itself into his psyche, quietly, relentlessly. Consider the subtle art of emotional pacing, the way a woman chooses when to share, when to withhold, when to speak her desires and when to sit in silence. It is here, in the rhythm of measured disclosure, that the alchemy occurs. He is not coerced, not forced into reflection, but gently guided to confront his own inner landscape. Her restraint is not cruelty, it is a revelation of value. Her boundaries are not walls, they are invitations to meet her at her own level of consciousness. With each encounter, each touch, each word thoughtfully placed, he begins to map the contours of her inner life, feeling drawn not merely to the image she presents, but to the energy, the mystery, and the autonomy she embodies. Emotional addiction, in this sense, is not an imposition, it is a magnetism that arises naturally from depth. And yet, the profoundest pull emerges not from what she does in his presence, but from how she carries herself in his absence. When a woman maintains a life that is not contingent upon his attention, when she fills her days with purpose, creativity, and emotional richness, she becomes a living reminder of possibility. Her world continues in motion whether he participates or observes, and this non-dependence, paradoxically, is what entwines him most powerfully. He notices the laughter she shares with friends, the fire in her eyes when she pursues a passion, the calm sovereignty with which she navigates her challenges. In watching her thrive independently, he experiences a pull that is equal parts admiration, desire, and compulsion, a recognition that she is not to be contained, yet she is to be revered. He becomes tethered not by insistence, not by pursuit, but by the quiet intensity of a woman who inhabits herself fully. There is a rhythm in this, an unconscious choreography that few recognize. She understands that emotional addiction is rarely born from repetition or proximity, it is born from contrast, the juxtaposition of presence and absence, attention and detachment, revelation and enigma. Each pause, each thoughtful silence, is a subtle invitation for him to confront the depth he senses but cannot yet articulate. In these moments, he is confronted with his own emotional voids, his unmet needs, and the shadowy territories of desire he has long avoided. And he begins to chase, not because she demands it, but because he cannot help himself. The pull is organic, unforced, a reflection of the inner gravity she radiates simply by existing with awareness. Imagine the way she moves through the world, carrying her dignity as though it were an aura. Every gesture, no matter how small, communicates self-possession. Her eyes are not anxious, they are reflective, discerning, and playful. Her words do not seek to bind or to entrap, they are deliberate, resonating with intelligence and emotional attunement. She understands that the unconscious mind perceives more than logic alone, that resonance travels deeper than argument, and that a single look, a soft laugh, or a measured pause can awaken a desire stronger than any chase could provoke. In her presence, he feels seen in a way that is rare, intimate, and unsettling, he feels both acknowledged and confronted, desired yet challenged. And in this delicate tension, his emotional investment grows, quietly but inexorably. Do you notice how the principle of scarcity works in tandem with authenticity? The woman who cultivates emotional addiction is never performing absence as a trick, she is simply unavailable to the dictates of external validation. Her attention is earned not by cleverness or manipulation, but by the genuine vibrancy of her inner life. When she chooses where and how to engage, she exercises sovereignty. He senses it, he feels it, and he cannot resist. In every story of pursuit that reverses into obsession, it is often the woman's self-possession, not her concession, that ignites the spark. Her depth creates a gravitational field that draws him in, and every act of patience, every deliberate choice to withhold or to reveal, amplifies the pull. His mind and heart become entwined in a subtle dance, compelled by what he cannot control, yet craves endlessly. It is essential to recognize that this process is not about control or domination, it is about magnetism. Emotional addiction does not flourish in desperation, it flourishes in measured presence, in the radiant autonomy of a woman who does not collapse under his gaze, yet is fully available when she chooses to engage. She allows herself to be fully herself, without compromise, and in doing so, she invites him to meet her at a level he may have never known existed. Every shared glance, every word that carries weight, every gesture that echoes with meaning, serves as a thread weaving him into a tapestry he did not know he needed. He does not realize the extent to which he is drawn until he finds himself reflecting, longing, imagining, and ultimately, acting in ways that reveal the depth of his emotional dependency, all without a single plea or chase. This dynamic is heightened by the understanding that the unconscious is far more receptive than the conscious mind. She does not merely act on the surface, she engages the undercurrents of his psyche, the unspoken territories where desire and shadow intertwine. By maintaining a life of substance, cultivating passions, nurturing friendships, and embracing moments of solitude, she becomes both a mirror and a catalyst. He glimpses not only what he wants in her, but what he lacks in himself. And here, in the interplay of reflection and projection, his mind begins to circle around her, haunted by curiosity, admiration, and a mounting need to understand and possess the very essence of what she represents. Every subtle act, her laughter, her gaze, her measured presence, cements the addictive loop, a gravitational rhythm that he cannot escape because it speaks to something ancient, something primal, and profoundly intimate. There is also a poetic cruelty in this truth, one that few acknowledge openly. The more he desires, the less he can anticipate. The more he chases shadows of her autonomy, the more he becomes entangled in his own longing. Each moment she chooses silence over explanation, autonomy over acquiescence, invites him to grapple with his own reflection, the parts of himself that crave, that fear, that lack. And yet, she remains unmoved, unwavering, the eye of her own storm. This is the essence of emotional addiction. It is not coercion, not manipulation, but a magnetic dialogue between two unconscious landscapes, a tension so finely tuned that desire becomes inextricable from thought, memory, and emotion. He is drawn inexorably, almost imperceptibly, yet undeniably, into the orbit she defines, and in this gravitational pull, the subtle power of her presence asserts itself fully, leaving no space for chase, only for longing and surrender. There is a rhythm to this unspoken seduction, a cadence that is felt rather than heard, an architecture of attraction that moves beneath the surface of his awareness. She does not speak in commands or demands, she moves through her own life as though it were sacred, sacred because she values it, because she embodies the alchemy of her own desires. And in witnessing this, he cannot help but notice. He notices the way she smiles without apology, the way she sets boundaries with grace, the way she pursues joy not for him, but for herself. Each act, seemingly ordinary in isolation, coalesces into an irresistible tapestry of magnetism. He begins to anticipate her presence, to remember her absence with longing, to crave the fleeting moments of connection as if they were fragments of some deeper truth he has yet to comprehend. He is addicted not because she bends to him, but because she does not because she chases, but because she chooses. Consider the profound subtlety in her engagement. She is warm, yet unattainable in the sense that her attention is not indiscriminate. She cultivates intrigue through selective revelation, offering glimpses of her world that are rich, textured, and enigmatic. He senses her depth, feels the weight of her interior life, and in doing so is drawn into a gravitational pull that he cannot name, much less resist. The mind, the conscious mind, may protest, may attempt to rationalize, but the unconscious, the fertile ground of emotion, desire, and shadow, is captivated. Here, in these quiet interludes of presence and absence, the addictive loop solidifies, weaving its tendrils into thought, memory, and longing. Each encounter becomes a subtle reinforcement, each pause a quiet intensifier, each smile a silent promise that is never fully spoken. Now imagine the way she carries herself even in solitude, in the spaces where he is absent. Her life is vibrant, full, and intentionally lived. She cultivates passions that nourish her soul, friendships that enrich her experience, and moments of stillness that reconnect her with her own being. In doing so, she becomes a living paradox, both independent and magnetic, uncontainable yet intimate, unknowable yet deeply resonant. He glimpses her life, whether through stories, shared moments, or mutual connections, and experiences a surge of desire, not for possession, but for alignment, for connection, for a taste of the wholeness she embodies. Emotional addiction thrives in these spaces because she has mastered the balance of presence and absence, of revelation and mystery, of engagement and detachment. Do you notice the elegance of restraint in this dynamic? It is not born of fear or insecurity, nor of a calculated attempt to manipulate. It is born of self-possession, of the understanding that her value is inherent and unassailable. She does not inflate herself to attract, she does not diminish herself to appease. Instead, she maintains a steady equilibrium, a poised center that radiates calm certainty. And in this equilibrium, he feels the pull of something profound, something that cannot be engineered, coerced, or chased. He is drawn to the energy she emanates, the unspoken promise of a woman who is whole, and therefore impossible to fully claim, yet impossible to forget. His mind loops through her presence and absence alike, constructing scenarios, imagining futures, and internalizing the subtle rhythms she has woven around him. The interplay of mystery and consistency is equally vital. She is neither predictable nor erratic, she is consistent in her values, her integrity, and her self-respect, but unpredictable in the ways she expresses her vibrancy. One day, a spontaneous laugh over a shared memory, the next, a reflective silence that hints at inner depth. Each oscillation reinforces the magnetic pull, creating an emotional rhythm that he unconsciously tracks and craves. In this rhythm, he begins to anchor his desire to her presence, to her essence, and to the emotional landscapes she subtly navigates. It is a quiet form of mastery, a psychological choreography that engages his shadow, his longing, and his unconscious needs without a word of instruction or imposition. He becomes addicted, not to her compliance, but to her complexity, not to her submission, but to her sovereignty. And yet, it is not merely the balance of presence and absence, the cultivation of mystery, or the subtle rhythms of engagement that hold him. It is also her refusal to chase, her deliberate choice to allow him the space to engage his own desire. By not bending to his insecurities, by not diluting her essence to soothe his discomfort, she forces him to confront his own emotional depths. His longing becomes active, creative, and self-reflective. He begins to chase, not because she demanded it, but because his unconscious recognizes in her the reflection of what he lacks within himself, the integration, the depth, the courage to inhabit his own life fully. Each of her deliberate choices becomes a mirror, revealing not only her value but his own shadows, his own hungers, and his own capacity for emotional resonance. He begins to orbit her life with a quiet obsession, drawn by forces he cannot name. Each encounter becomes a thread in a tapestry that he cannot resist unraveling, each absence a magnet pulling him toward her. And it is in these spaces of subtle influence, of poised silence and intentional presence, that the architecture of emotional addiction solidifies. She does not manipulate, she does not scheme, she simply inhabits herself with an unyielding richness that he cannot ignore. Her laughter echoes in his memory, her gaze lingers in the corners of his thoughts, and her boundaries, clear, respected, unwavering, become the very gravity that anchors him to her world. The addictiveness arises not from scarcity alone, but from the profound contrast between the fullness she offers and the impossibility of possession. Observe the interplay of desire and restraint, the way he is invited to reach deeper into his own psyche without realizing it. She understands, instinctively and consciously, that to chase her would be to diminish the very thing he craves. Instead, she allows him space to engage with the longing she evokes, to wrestle with the shadows of himself that she mirrors. In every silence, every thoughtful pause, he encounters not emptiness, but the quiet power of autonomy. Her presence is not a haven he can claim at will, it is a summons to rise, to reflect, to stretch toward emotional maturity he may have ignored. He begins to chase, not for control, not for possession, but for resonance, for the rare experience of a woman who is fully herself, whose inner life is vivid, autonomous, and uncontainable. Imagine the alchemy of his inner world as he internalizes these rhythms. Every interaction, each word carefully chosen, each subtle act of engagement, becomes an anchor in his unconscious. He begins to replay her expressions, her gestures, her rhythms in the theater of his mind. The pull intensifies not because she demands it, but because she is the reflection of the potential he senses in himself: freedom, depth, emotional courage. She embodies the qualities he craves yet cannot create alone, and in this reflection, he experiences the quiet thrill of recognition, of longing, and ultimately, of emotional addiction. He becomes entwined, not through pressure or plea, but through a magnetic interplay that feels inevitable, necessary, and hauntingly irresistible. Do you see the subtle mastery in her engagement? She is fully alive, fully expressive, fully herself, yet she never collapses into the orbit of his desires. Her attention is deliberate, her energy intentionally directed, and her presence is a sovereign force that neither dominates nor submits. In this sovereignty, he feels the compelling force of her being. She does not need him to validate her, to amplify her, or to complete her; she is already complete. And in this truth, he encounters a paradox: the more she exists as her own fullness, the more irresistibly he is drawn to her. He chases not because he can control, not because he must claim, but because his psyche recognizes, at a deep unconscious level, the rarity, the value, and the magnetism of a woman who refuses to be diminished. Consider now the transformative effect of her emotional rhythm on him. He becomes acutely aware of moments of engagement, their significance magnified by the intervals of absence. Every gesture she offers, every smile, every glance, every pause is weighted with meaning because it emerges from a woman fully anchored in herself. The human psyche is drawn to contrast, to patterns of presence and absence, to the mystery that refuses to be fully known. By embodying this truth, she cultivates an irresistible gravitational pull, one that entwines desire with respect, longing with admiration, and curiosity with obsession. He does not need to be instructed, guided, or pressured; he is drawn by the simple, undeniable truth of her self-possession. Even his conscious mind may resist, may rationalize, may attempt to minimize the pull he feels, yet the unconscious mind, richer, deeper, more primal, has already registered the subtle orchestration of her energy. Each encounter reinforces patterns that deepen attachment: her depth, her autonomy, her laughter, her gaze, the cadence of her attention. He becomes emotionally invested because she exists as a complete, sovereign being, not because he can contain her, but because her presence awakens parts of himself he cannot ignore. Emotional addiction, in this sense, is not manipulation, it is the natural consequence of resonance, depth, and the deliberate cultivation of selfhood. In witnessing her life, he confronts the vastness of his own emotional landscape, and in doing so, becomes irresistibly, inexorably entwined. And yet, she remains untethered. She does not collapse into expectation, she does not bend to appease, she does not chase. She is free, autonomous, radiant, and full of life. It is this freedom, paradoxically, that makes him crave her most. He chases not for possession, but for connection, not for control, but for resonance. Every subtle act, every thoughtful engagement, every pause in presence or absence, reinforces the gravitational pull. He becomes addicted to not merely her, but to what she represents: depth, sovereignty, mystery, and the embodiment of a woman who knows her worth, lives it fully, and requires nothing beyond herself to remain whole. And within this intricate dance of attention and absence, he begins to confront the parts of himself he has long ignored. Her sovereignty acts as a mirror, reflecting not only the depth he admires but also the incompleteness he has avoided. Each encounter is a subtle challenge, to rise, to feel, to engage with his own shadow, to wrestle with the unconscious stirrings she evokes. He begins to question his habits, his choices, his desires, slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if drawn by an invisible current. And in this questioning, he becomes entangled in a loop of longing that is self-generated, an emotional addiction that has nothing to do with coercion and everything to do with resonance. She is the catalyst, he is the alchemy. He chases not because he must, but because he is compelled to grow, to seek, to understand, and to feel. There is a sacred tension here, one that must be navigated with careful awareness. She must maintain the delicate balance between revelation and restraint, warmth and distance, engagement and autonomy. Too much exposure, and the gravity dissipates; too much absence, and curiosity may turn to disinterest. Yet within these oscillations, there is an artistry, a quiet mastery that shapes the emotional landscape of his desire. He becomes enthralled not by the surface of her being, but by the depths she gestures toward, the richness of her inner life, and the mystery of her autonomy. Each interaction becomes a symbolic contract, a silent agreement to honor her presence, even in her absence, to engage with her life on her terms, and to grapple with his own emotional capacity. Observe now the subtle use of contrast in her energy. She is radiant, yet grounded, accessible, yet untouchable, intimate, yet sovereign. Each facet amplifies the other, creating a tension that he cannot resolve without returning to her, without seeking her attention, without attempting to decode her rhythms. Her laughter becomes a lure, her silence a summons, her presence a sanctuary, and her absence a reminder of his own longing. He is addicted not to her compliance, but to the emotional tension she fosters through her balance, depth, and intentionality. This is not manipulation, it is the natural consequence of a woman who is fully realized and uncompromising in her self-possession. And as he becomes increasingly entwined, she continues to cultivate her own life, her passions, her solitude, and her joy. She does not live in the orbit of his desire, she orbits herself. Her world is rich, textured, and intentionally lived, a living proof of the power of autonomy. And in observing this, he is drawn not into control or possession, but into admiration, longing, and desire that is self-propelled. The addiction deepens not through demand, but through resonance, through reflection, through the recognition that what she embodies is rare, profound, and in many ways, unattainable. He cannot contain her because she is not a container, she is a field, a force, a presence that exists independently of him, yet inevitably entwines his consciousness with hers. Do you see the poetry in this tension, the artistry in the restraint? She becomes simultaneously a challenge and a reward, a mirror and a guide, a presence and a spark of absence. Every interaction, no matter how brief, reinforces the gravitational pull, because she has anchored herself so fully in her own being that nothing she offers feels cheap or easy. He chases not because he can, but because the very act of chasing awakens a desire within him that mirrors the depth he witnesses in her. Each gesture, each word, each pause is a quiet affirmation of her autonomy and an invitation for him to meet it, to engage with it, and to become captivated by it. Even the simplest moments, an unexpected text, a shared laugh, a fleeting glance, become charged with meaning. They are not weighted artificially, nor are they performances designed to manipulate. They are natural consequences of a woman who inhabits her life fully, who engages with presence and intention, and who honors her own depth above all else. And in these moments, he is drawn, inexorably, into the orbit of her energy, his mind circling, his heart entangled, his desires stirred, and his longing intensified. The addiction is emotional, psychological, and unconscious, yet undeniable, profound, and self-sustaining. She has mastered the subtle art of creating attraction not through chase, not through demand, but through sovereign existence. And in this dance, he begins to realize, perhaps too late, perhaps only gradually, that the pull he feels is not about possession, not about control, and not about her compliance. It is about resonance, depth, and the reflection of a life lived fully. He becomes addicted not to the surface of her being, but to the gravity of her presence, the autonomy she maintains, and the mystery she embodies. She does not chase, she does not plead, she does not bend. And in this, she wields a subtle yet inexorable power, one that is both invisible and absolute, and one that ensures that he is drawn, over and over, into her orbit, seeking not her submission, but the rare privilege of connection to a woman who knows herself, honors herself, and requires nothing from him but authenticity. He begins to measure time not by hours or minutes, but by the cadence of her presence and absence. Each interaction, no matter how fleeting, becomes a meditation on longing, a silent testament to the magnetic pull she cultivates. She does not chase, she does not plead, she does not compromise her essence for the sake of his attention. And yet, in this refusal to yield, she becomes the axis around which his desires revolve. The unconscious recognizes her sovereignty, and it begins to encode patterns of longing and anticipation, weaving them into the neural pathways of his mind. Each thought of her becomes a small ritual, a compulsion that is not imposed but invited, a yearning that he feels compelled to honor, consciously or not. Emotional addiction, in this sense, is not a product of manipulation, it is the natural consequence of resonance, of depth, of a woman who exists fully in her own right. Notice how her subtle mastery operates through contrast and nuance. She is present, yet never clingy, expressive, yet never predictable, radiant, yet rooted in her own center. Each oscillation between connection and distance, intimacy and detachment, becomes a pulse that the psyche cannot ignore. He internalizes these rhythms, replaying them in the theater of his mind, craving the next encounter, anticipating the next spark of recognition, longing for the continuity of a presence that remains always just out of reach. Her power lies not in controlling him, but in creating a dynamic in which he feels compelled to engage, compelled to invest, compelled to seek the resonance that she naturally emits. It is a subtle seduction of the psyche, a psychological choreography that elicits desire without a word of instruction or demand. Even the simplest gestures acquire profound weight. A fleeting smile, a thoughtfully sent message, a glance that lingers slightly longer than expected, all become anchors in his unconscious, cues that reinforce attachment, longing, and fascination. These moments are not rehearsed or engineered, they are the natural manifestations of a woman who inhabits her life with intentionality and self-possession. Her joy is not conditional upon his response, her attention is not contingent upon his validation. And yet, each gesture acts as a magnet, drawing him into a cycle of emotional engagement that he experiences as both irresistible and inevitable. He becomes addicted not to her compliance or attention, but to the vibrancy, depth, and sovereignty she embodies. Her power also emerges through the cultivation of mystery. She reveals herself selectively, offering glimpses into her inner world while maintaining the integrity of her depth. He perceives richness in her silence, intrigue in her choices, and allure in the parts of her being she keeps sacred. This mystery is not deceit, it is the natural consequence of autonomy, of a life lived on her own terms, and of a refusal to collapse into predictability for the sake of comfort or approval. Each layer he uncovers intensifies the pull, creating a rhythm of curiosity and desire that anchors him further to her presence, even when she is physically absent. Emotional addiction thrives in these spaces of partial revelation and autonomous integrity, where longing is invited but never fully satiated. He also becomes increasingly entwined because she engages his unconscious, the deeper layers of his psyche that govern desire, attachment, and projection. By existing fully as herself, she reflects back the potential he senses in his own life, the courage, autonomy, and vibrancy he longs to cultivate. In pursuing her, he is ultimately pursuing a reflection of his own unactualized capacities, a mirror that awakens parts of himself that have been dormant or neglected. She does not instruct, manipulate, or direct, she simply embodies what he unconsciously seeks, and in this embodiment, she becomes a force that compels him to engage, to reflect, and to invest emotionally. Her influence is subtle, profound, and almost alchemical in its effect on the psyche. Even his conscious mind, the part that rationalizes, protests, or seeks control, cannot fully grasp the depth of his attraction. It is the unconscious, fertile and impressionable, that registers the rhythms, the presence, and the autonomy she embodies. Each interaction, each pause, each subtle gesture, becomes a reinforcement of desire, attachment, and fascination. He becomes compelled, drawn, and snared, not by manipulation, not by pressure, not by the promise of easy conquest, but by the undeniable gravitational pull of a woman who exists fully, whose life is rich, whose boundaries are firm, and whose essence is magnetic. She does not chase, she does not plead, she does not diminish herself to appease. And in this, she becomes irresistible, emotionally unforgettable, and profoundly addictive. And in this quiet orchestration, he begins to notice that his emotions are no longer casual or fleeting, they have taken on a weight, a texture, a rhythm that mirrors the cadence of her life. He measures days by the anticipation of her presence, nights by the echo of her laughter, moments by the memory of her gaze. She does not demand this attention, nor does she orchestrate it with conscious intent, it arises naturally, inevitably, from the radiance of her self-possession. She has cultivated a field of attraction so subtle and profound that he finds himself drawn not to what she does, but to who she is. And in this, the deepest paradox emerges: the more she is herself, the less she chases, the more he desires. His attachment is self-generated, a feedback loop of longing that is both compulsive and liberating, both tethering and expansive. She understands the sacred geometry of absence and presence. She knows that to be entirely available is to flatten desire, to be entirely absent is to diminish connection. Through intuitive mastery, she oscillates between these poles, offering just enough warmth to invite pursuit and just enough restraint to cultivate longing. He begins to anticipate, to wonder, to project his own fantasies and aspirations onto the canvas of her presence. Her autonomy does not repel, it compels. Her indifference to control does not alienate, it enchants. In this subtle rhythm, he becomes ensnared, not through coercion, not through pursuit, but through the elegant inevitability of resonance, contrast, and depth. Notice how she uses her energy as both mirror and magnet. In her interactions, she reflects his desires, fears, and potentials, forcing him to confront what he seeks in life, love, and self-understanding. Yet she does so without intrusion, without judgment, without collapse into expectation. He is drawn to her precisely because she does not fix, correct, or complete him, she simply exists fully, authentically, and sovereignly. And in witnessing her life, he encounters the rare thrill of resonance, the intoxicating blend of admiration, longing, and curiosity that fuels his emotional addiction. It is not about manipulation, it is about depth, authenticity, and the subtle power of living unapologetically in one's own truth. Even his moments of frustration or confusion serve to deepen the connection. When she does not respond immediately, when she engages on her own terms, he is forced to grapple with patience, desire, and self-restraint. These intervals are not voids, they are the fertile soil of longing, reflection, and internalization. He begins to carry her presence within him, to replay gestures, expressions, and words in the theater of his mind. Emotional addiction crystallizes not in moments of overt intimacy, but in the quiet, electric spaces between engagement and absence, in the subtle tension that she evokes by simply existing fully and deliberately. Each encounter, each pause, each interaction becomes a lesson in desire, autonomy, and psychological gravity. Her mastery is heightened by the cultivation of unpredictability. She is consistent in her self-possession, yet fluid in expression. He can never anticipate fully how she will engage, what nuance she will reveal, what depth she will gesture toward. In this unpredictability, the unconscious mind is captivated. It seeks patterns, craves understanding, and finds both challenge and satisfaction in her rhythms. She becomes a living puzzle, a dynamic force whose energy cannot be contained or diminished, whose presence must be engaged with on its own terms. His emotional addiction grows because she has built a landscape of tension, curiosity, and resonance, one that he cannot leave, even if he wishes to, because it stirs the very parts of himself that have been dormant, neglected, or unexplored. She also wields the quiet power of indifference to outcome. She is not tethered to his pursuit, she does not collapse for attention, she does not negotiate her worth. In this, he is confronted with the unassailable truth of her autonomy. His desire is amplified precisely because it cannot be forced or predicted, because it must arise from genuine attraction to her essence, not from circumstance, pressure, or opportunity. He chases because he is compelled by resonance, by challenge, by curiosity, by the intoxicating depth of a woman who stands fully realized in her own life. And with every step he takes, every thought he returns to her, every longing that stirs within him, the subtle architecture of emotional addiction strengthens, anchored not in coercion, but in the gravity of her presence, the brilliance of her autonomy, and the mystery she embodies. And as he becomes increasingly entwined in this silent web of influence, he begins to sense something transformative, not just in his desire for her, but in the stirring of his own inner life. She has awakened something essential, a deeper hunger for authenticity, connection, and engagement with his own emotional landscape. She does not demand this awakening, she simply mirrors the potential for it, reflecting back the life he could lead if he were as present, as sovereign, as alive as she is. The emotional addiction she evokes is therefore not a simple craving, it is an invitation to growth, to reflection, and to resonance with the rare and uncompromising presence of a woman who knows her worth, stands in her power, and requires nothing beyond herself to remain whole. And in this crescendo of subtle influence, he finds himself transformed in ways he cannot name, driven by impulses that feel both ancient and immediate. She has awakened the archetypes within him, the hunter, the seeker, the lover, and even the shadow he rarely confronts. Each interaction becomes a stage upon which his psyche performs, negotiating desire, curiosity, longing, and reflection. He is caught in a dance that is neither fully conscious nor entirely under his control, a choreography dictated by resonance and gravitas rather than instruction or manipulation. The more she remains unchaste, unclaimed, uncollapsed into his orbit, the more he is drawn, compelled not only by fascination but by the stirring of his own potential, mirrored in the depth of her being. Her presence catalyzes introspection. He begins to notice the patterns of his own attachment, the familiar scripts he has repeated with others, the unconscious shadows that shape his behaviors and desires. And yet, she does not confront him directly. She does not lecture, plead, or correct. She simply exists in a space of self-possession so complete that it becomes impossible for him to ignore. He is drawn into her orbit, and in that orbit, he sees the contours of his own incompleteness and the possibilities for his own awakening. Emotional addiction in this sense is not a trap, it is a mirror. It is a reflection of the intensity, depth, and vibrancy he glimpses in her, projected outward, experienced viscerally, and encoded deeply within his psyche. The artistry lies in her ability to cultivate presence without attachment. Every word, every gesture, every pause carries significance because it is not tethered to expectation. She does not chase, she does not plead, she does not compromise. Her laughter, her attention, her subtle invitations are rewards of resonance, not tools of coercion. He becomes addicted not to her compliance, not to her accessibility, but to the energetic field she generates through authentic self-possession. It is a force invisible yet palpable, subtle yet irresistible, like a tide that cannot be turned back once it begins its rhythmic pull. He cannot help but engage, to invest emotionally, to return again and again to the gravitational pull of her depth and autonomy. Even in silence, she speaks volumes. The pauses, the intervals, the absences are deliberate, not manipulative, creating space for reflection, longing, and emotional internalization. He carries her presence with him, replaying her expressions, gestures, and words in the theater of his mind. Emotional addiction crystallizes not in overt intimacy, but in these suspended moments, charged with anticipation, curiosity, and subtle tension. She does not create drama, she creates space for desire to breathe, for longing to deepen, and for resonance to take root. In this space, he begins to feel the unmistakable pull of dependence, not on her actions, but on the energy she emanates, on the life she lives, and on the autonomy she embodies. The complexity of her mastery is revealed in contrast. She is radiant yet grounded, intimate yet sovereign, expressive yet unpredictable. Each oscillation between these qualities creates tension that is psychologically compelling. He begins to see her not merely as a woman to be pursued, but as a standard, a mirror, a measure of what is possible in human presence and self-possession. He is compelled to engage, not through force or obligation, but through the magnetism of her authenticity. The more she inhabits her own life fully, the more he chases, not to possess, but to understand, to resonate with, and to reconnect with the vibrancy she reflects. She has become the axis around which his emotional world spins, the gravity that both challenges and captivates, the spark that ignites longing and fascination without uttering a single command. And as this dynamic unfolds, he begins to realize that his emotional addiction is tied less to her and more to the awakening she induces within him. She embodies a fullness, a sovereignty, a depth that he unconsciously recognizes as rare, compelling, and transformative. In pursuing her, he is pursuing the reflection of what he might become if he were willing to meet life with the same intensity, presence, and authenticity. Every thought of her, every anticipation, every return to her orbit is a reinforcement of this invisible, psychological contract, one that demands nothing from her but recognition of her own worth, and yet calls forth the most profound responses from him. The beauty of this dynamic lies in its ethical subtlety. She does not manipulate, she does not coerce, she does not compromise. Her addiction-inducing presence is the natural consequence of a life lived fully and unapologetically. It is the gravitational pull of authenticity, the magnetic field of self-possession, the irresistible force of a woman who honors her depth, her autonomy, and her inner world. He becomes addicted not because she pursues, but because she exists, and in existing fully, she awakens his desire, his curiosity, and his longing in a way that is both inevitable and profound. He is drawn to her, compelled by her, and ensnared by a force he cannot name, yet feels in every thought, every pulse, every moment of longing that stirs within him. ChatGPT said. And in the culmination of this subtle orchestration, he begins to recognize that the addiction he feels is not merely to her presence, but to the space she creates within him, the tension between desire and restraint, curiosity and discovery, longing and fulfillment. She has awakened the archetypal currents that flow beneath conscious thought, the eternal dance between the anima and animus, the shadow and the ego, the call to individuation and the pull of relational entanglement. He is compelled because she touches parts of his psyche that few have accessed, that few could hold without fracturing, that few could awaken without reverence. She does not chase him, yet he is endlessly drawn, compelled to return, compelled to invest emotionally, compelled to explore the depths she reveals by simply being herself. The power she wields is invisible yet undeniable. It manifests not in manipulation or strategy, but in the profound gravity of her being, in the authenticity that radiates from her choices, in the integrity of her boundaries, and in the quiet confidence that she will never collapse to appease or placate. He senses this unconsciously, registering the magnetic field of her autonomy before he even names it in thought. Every interaction becomes a pulse in this field, a note in a symphony that he cannot stop listening to, a rhythm that he cannot resist following. Emotional addiction becomes less about dependence and more about attunement, a synchronization of desire and curiosity, a longing for the reflection of life lived fully, bravely, and without compromise. She understands the subtle artistry of contrast. In her presence, he experiences warmth without surrender, attention without demand, intimacy without entanglement. In her absence, he encounters mystery, longing, and a reflection of his own desires unfulfilled. This oscillation is not accidental, it is the natural expression of a woman who inhabits her life fully, who honors her own rhythms, and who refuses to dilute her essence for approval or affection. He becomes emotionally addicted because the very structure of her being, her presence, her autonomy, her vibrancy, induces fascination and longing that are beyond conscious control. It is the architecture of desire, constructed not with intent to ensnare, but with the simple, unassailable truth of self-possession. Even his conscious attempts to rationalize, resist, or control the pull fail against the currents she has stirred. He recognizes the addictive quality of her presence yet cannot disentangle himself. He sees the magnetic tension she generates and feels compelled to engage, not out of obligation or fear, but because the energy she emits resonates with parts of himself that have long been dormant or repressed. He becomes captivated by the subtle interplay of presence and absence, by the oscillation between intimacy and autonomy, by the depth and unpredictability of her inner life. She has created a psychological landscape so rich and compelling that his mind cannot rest, his emotions cannot settle, and his desire cannot abate. And in this unfolding, he experiences transformation. She does not seek to change him, she does not seek to mold him or direct him. Yet by existing fully, authentically, and sovereignly, she activates potentials within him that he had ignored, avoided, or denied. He is confronted with his own capacity for depth, reflection, and engagement. He is compelled to rise to meet the intensity she embodies, to reflect on his own patterns, to reckon with his own shadows. The emotional addiction she evokes is therefore not a trap, it is a catalyst, an awakening, a call to presence and self-actualization that he cannot ignore because it is both irresistible and necessary. Her mastery also lies in her detachment from outcome. She does not need his affirmation, his attention, or his compliance to validate herself. She stands in her own sovereignty, and this clarity creates a gravitational field that he cannot resist. Her indifference to external control is not coldness, it is the profound assurance of a life lived fully. He chases, not because she commands it, not because she demands it, but because he recognizes in her a reflection of his own longing for vitality, autonomy, and resonance. Each return to her orbit, each thought of her, each pulse of desire reinforces the addictive pattern, not through manipulation, but through the natural consequence of authentic, sovereign presence. And as he becomes increasingly entwined in the currents she has set in motion, he begins to sense something deeper than mere attraction. He is addicted not only to her, but to the awakening she invokes within him, the subtle stirring of longing, the confrontation with shadow, the echo of potential realized. She has become both magnet and mirror, compulsion and catalyst, presence and challenge. In pursuing her, he pursues his own reflection, his own resonance, his own engagement with life lived fully and without compromise. She has created a gravitational field that he cannot escape, and he does not wish to, because it awakens the very parts of him that hunger for depth, intensity, and authenticity. And in this final unfolding of influence, he begins to recognize that the addiction she inspires is woven from threads far subtler than mere attention or affection. It is crafted from the rhythm of her autonomy, the cadence of her self-possession, the quiet insistence that she will not compromise her essence for approval or reassurance. Each gesture, each pause, each glance is imbued with resonance, not strategy, magnetism, not coercion. He feels it in the slow pull of anticipation, in the flutter of thought that returns unbidden to her presence, in the silent question, what does she see in me that I cannot yet see in myself? She does not answer, yet the question lingers, deepens, and multiplies, and with it, his emotional dependency grows, not as a product of manipulation, but as an inevitable consequence of her embodiment of self-sovereignty. He begins to inhabit her energy even when she is absent, replaying the subtle cues, the delicate harmonies of her presence, the unspoken rhythms of her life. In her steadiness, he finds both challenge and delight. In her unpredictability, he discovers fascination and longing. She has constructed a psychic architecture in which he is compelled to move, to reflect, to desire, not because she commands it, but because her existence, in its depth and authenticity, calls forth his own inner engagement. Each emotional return, each surge of thought, each instinctive impulse to reconnect is a testament to the profound resonance she has cultivated, not through force, but through subtle mastery of presence, contrast, and gravitas. And yet, she does not confine him to this orbit. She does not demand compliance, attention, or surrender. She exists fully in her life, in her rhythms, in her world, and it is precisely this freedom that amplifies the addiction. He is drawn not to dependency, but to challenge, not to control, but to resonance, not to possession, but to presence. He chases because his psyche recognizes an unmatched depth, an irreplaceable gravity, an authentic power that reflects the very qualities he longs to embody himself. She does not create longing artificially, she cultivates a field in which desire flourishes naturally, inevitably, and irresistibly, the byproduct of integrity, autonomy, and the quiet brilliance of a woman unchained from expectation. Within this dynamic, his shadow emerges, the unexamined, unacknowledged, and often denied parts of himself that stir in response to her. He confronts jealousy, desire, insecurity, and fascination, and yet she neither fears nor feeds these impulses. Her role is not to soothe, correct, or control, but to mirror the intensity of her presence back to him, creating a reflective surface in which he encounters his own depths. Emotional addiction, then, is not mere attachment, it is the stirring of unconscious forces, a compelling resonance of psyche to psyche, the echo of archetypal patterns that awaken when a woman inhabits her life fully, sovereignly, and unapologetically. The subtle mastery she embodies is amplified by rhythm and contrast. Presence without possession, attention without entanglement, intimacy without collapse, absence without erasure. Each oscillation between these states cultivates fascination, reflection, and longing. He is caught not by design, but by inevitability, the gravitational pull of her life, the brilliance of her autonomy, the hypnotic tension between engagement and restraint. He becomes addicted not because she manipulates, but because she illuminates the intensity of existence, the depth of feeling, the awakening of desires that have lain dormant, neglected, or suppressed. In her orbit, he finds both challenge and sanctuary, tension and release, longing and awakening. And as he spirals deeper into this subtle addiction, he is confronted with a paradox. The very force that binds him is not rooted in her efforts to capture or claim him, but in her refusal to be captured, claimed, or diminished. He becomes entwined with the reflection of what she is, and simultaneously, with the reflection of what he could be, a man stirred by autonomy, engaged with depth, and compelled to awaken to the richness of experience she embodies. Every thought of her, every emotional pull, every return to the orbit she generates is a testament to the profound psychological resonance that arises when desire meets sovereignty, longing meets depth, and emotional addiction is born not from pursuit, but from reflection, mirroring, and irresistible presence. In the end, the woman's power lies not in the chase, but in the unwavering embodiment of her essence. He cannot help but desire, cannot help but return, cannot help but feel drawn, because she has created a space that is irresistible in its authenticity, magnetic in its sovereignty, and transformative in its depth. The addiction is not his to control, and it is not hers to manufacture. It emerges naturally from the harmony of presence, autonomy, and depth. He is captivated because she stands in herself, because she refuses compromise, because she lives fully, and because she knows that true allure is not born from pursuit but from the luminous force of self-possession. And in witnessing her, he awakens; in chasing her, he discovers his own reflection; in longing, he encounters his own potential. The field she cultivates is both mirror and magnet, reflection and force, challenge and awakening. It is a subtle architecture of emotional addiction built not on need, not on demand, not on collapse, but on sovereign presence, authenticity, and the gravitational pull of a life lived fully, unapologetically, and in radiant truth. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.